They say the universe screamed on the day the outsider woke, but that's not quite true. The universe had been screaming for 60 million years, and we were only just beginning to hear it. The servitor's mechanical fingers trembled as they transcribed the astropathic message. This wasn't unusual. Most servants of the machine god developed small glitches after decades of service, but tech priest Dominius Varick noticed something different this time. The servitor wasn't malfunctioning. It was afraid. Impossible, Varick muttered, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the parchment emerging from the ancient data loom. Servitors didn't feel fear. That particular weakness had been scrubbed from their limited consciousness along with most other emotions. Yet here was Unit 77 Alpha, its biological components sweating, its human eye dilated with unmistakable terror as it continued its work. The message itself made even less sense than the servitor's reaction. It came from Astropath Meridian stationed in the galactic south, a region so quiet and unremarkable that most Imperial cartographers forgot it existed. The words were fragmented, broken, as if Meridian's mind had shattered while trying to comprehend what she was seeing. Sphere. Impossible size. Reflect everything. Stars bending. Light screaming. The hungry one wakes. The geometry is wrong. The angles don't. The message ended there. Meridian never sent another transmission. Neither did the 17 other astropaths stationed in the surrounding sectors. Within a solar week, an entire region of space had gone dark, as if someone had draped a blanket over the stars themselves. This is how it would begin, though nobody knew it yet. Not the Imperium with its billion worlds. Not the Eldar with their ancient knowledge. Not even the Necrons, who had been preparing for this moment since the war in heaven ended 60 million years ago. The outsider was coming home, and the galaxy was utterly unprepared for what that meant. But let me back up. Let me tell you a story about gods who ate each other, about a trick played by a laughing deity, and about something so massive and so impossibly mad that it makes the horrors of chaos look like children's nightmares. Let me tell you what happens when the thing that even gods feared decides to return from exile. Because that sphere beneath the galaxy, that impossible object larger than anything that should exist, had started to move. And it was heading toward the galactic plane with the slow, inevitable certainty of a guillotine blade falling toward a condemned man's neck. Captain Helena Sereth of the Imperial Navy had been staring at empty space for 6 months when the universe stopped making sense. Her assignment aboard the survey vessel Endless Vigil was supposed to be the kind of boring, career-ending posting that officers received when they'd angered someone important. And Helena had angered someone very important indeed. Lord Admiral Kreutzmann didn't appreciate junior officers pointing out his tactical mistakes in front of the entire command staff, even when those mistakes cost 3,000 lives. So here she was, commanding a skeleton crew on a ship barely worth the metal it was forged from, scanning the void beneath the galaxy for threats that never materialized. Pirates didn't come here. There was nothing to steal. Orcs didn't fight here. There was nothing to fight. Even the Tyranids avoided this region, and those creatures would eat anything. "Captain," said Scanner Servitor Prime, its voice crackling through damaged vocal cords that should have been replaced years ago. "Detecting anomalous readings at coordinate 77 Mark 15. Impossible light reflection signature." Helena didn't even look up from her data slate. Probably another ghost reading, another glitch in sensors that predated the age of apostasy. The Mechanicus kept promising to send a proper tech priest to fix their equipment, but that was 11 months ago. "Log it and move on, Servitor." "Captain." The Servitor's voice had changed. There was something in it that Helena had never heard from a Servitor before. Something that sounded almost like urgency. "You need to see this." The tactical display showed empty space, exactly as expected. Except, there. A single point of light where no light should be. Helena enhanced the image, and her blood ran cold. The object was spherical and perfect in its geometry. Too perfect. Nature didn't create perfect spheres, not at this scale. It sat in the void between galaxies like a marble dropped on an obsidian floor, visible only because it was reflecting starlight from the Milky Way millions of light years away. And if their sensors were correct, if the calculations weren't the result of some catastrophic equipment failure, the thing was 32 million times larger than Holy Terra herself. That's impossible, Helena whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. She'd studied the old reports, the ones stamped with red wax seals and marked for senior officers only. The ones that spoke of ancient gods and wars that predated humanity by millions of years. The ones that weren't supposed to be real. She opened a channel to the nearest Imperial outpost, her hands shaking as she entered the proper encryption codes. This is Captain Helena Sereth of the Endless Vigil broadcasting on Priority Alpha 1. I am reporting a potential Xenos Horrificus contact of unprecedented scale. Coordinates follow. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not. The sphere moved. It was impossible to see at first. Something that massive shouldn't be able to move, not without generating gravitational waves that would tear nearby stars from their orbits. But it did move, slowly, deliberately, like a predator that had just noticed fresh prey. The sphere began ascending toward the galactic plane, toward the spiral arms of the Milky Way, toward the light and life and souls that dwelled within. Helena's message never reached its destination. The Endless Vigil's navigator, a young woman named Cassidy who'd only received her third eye 6 months prior, began screaming in her sanctum. The scream went on for 47 seconds before stopping abruptly. When Helena and her security team breached the sealed chamber, they found Cassidy on the floor, her 3 eyes bleeding, her fingers clawed into the metal deck plating. The angles, Cassidy whispered, her voice raw and broken. The angles are wrong. The geometry doesn't bend the right way. There's something inside that sphere, and it's looking back at us. She died 3 minutes later, her mind burned out by whatever she'd seen in the warp. But before she died, she said one more thing that Helena would never forget. It's hungry. It's been hungry for so long. And now it remembers where to find food. Farser Eldarin of Craftworld Iandon had lived for over 900 years. He had witnessed the birth and death of stars, had seen empires rise and crumble into dust, had gazed into futures that would never come to pass and pasts that refused to remain buried. He had thought himself beyond surprise, beyond fear, beyond anything except the cold certainty that came with seeing all possible paths laid out before him like threads in a cosmic tapestry. He was wrong. The vision hit him during evening meditation, slamming into his consciousness with the force of a macrocannon shell. One moment he was floating peacefully in his chamber, his mind drifting through the near futures, cataloging threats and opportunities. The next moment, he was somewhere else. Someone else. He stood on a world that wasn't a world. The ground beneath his feet was metal, but metal that flowed and shifted like water, metal that formed angles that hurt to look at directly. The sky, if it could be called a sky, was a roiling mass of darkness punctuated by lights that might have been stars but moved with terrible purpose, like eyes turning to regard prey. All around him, beings moved through the impossible landscape. Humans, Eldar, Orcs, Tau, Necrons, every species in the galaxy wandered this labyrinth in various states of madness. Their eyes were empty, their movements mechanical, and yet something remained in them. Enough awareness to know they were trapped. Enough sanity to understand that they could never escape. But not enough to do anything about it except continue their endless, purposeless wandering through corridors that folded in on themselves in ways that violated every physical law. "Welcome," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that was simultaneously one voice and thousands of voices screaming in perfect unison. "Welcome to my harvest. Welcome to the place where all things end." Eldarin tried to move, to run, to do anything, but his body wouldn't respond. Something vast moved in the darkness above him, something so large that he couldn't perceive its full form. He caught glimpses, a limb here, an eye there, surfaces that reflected light in ways that light shouldn't bend. And faces. Thousands of faces rippling across its surface, each one screaming silently, each one the remnant of something that had been consumed and incorporated into the whole. "You remember me," the voice continued. "Your people remember me. The Harlequins told stories to frighten children. But I was never a story. I was never gone. I was just waiting. waiting for the stars to align, waiting for the moment when the harvest would be richest. The vision shifted. Eldarin saw the sphere from Helena's sensors, but now he understood what it was. Not just a Dyson sphere. Not just a prison. It was both and neither. It was a cocoon, a shell that contained something that had been growing stronger for 60 million years, feeding on its own madness, becoming something that transcended the already godlike power of the Tan. The outsider. Saranoga. The one who dwells beyond. The amalgamation of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of star gods, all consumed during a civil war that had been deliberately orchestrated by Segarak, the laughing god, for reasons that even the Eldar had never fully understood. The Necrons thought they could control us, the voice said, and now there was something like amusement in it. They thought they could shatter us into pieces, bind us in their trinkets, use us as weapons. They succeeded with my siblings. But not with me. I consumed too many. I became too vast. Too terrible. Even the Silent King fled rather than face me. And now I am coming home. The vision showed what would happen when the sphere reached the galactic plane. It showed worlds dying not from violence but from something worse, from meaning itself breaking down. Reality would become fluid near the outsider's presence, cause and effect would separate, time would flow backward and forward simultaneously. And everyone caught in its wake would join the harvest, trapped in an eternal labyrinth of impossible geometry, alive enough to suffer but not alive enough to die. Eldarin snapped back to his body with a gasp, blood running from his nose and ears. His attendants rushed to his side, but he waved them away, his mind racing. This wasn't just another threat to the Eldar. This was an extinction-level event for everyone. The outsider didn't discriminate. It didn't have grudges or preferences. It simply consumed, and when it was done, there would be nothing left but silence and darkness. He had to warn the other craft worlds. He had to contact the Harlequins, who would know more about this than any other Eldar. He had to do something, anything, because the alternative was unthinkable. But as he reached for his communication device, another thought struck him with horrifying clarity. What if the Harlequins had known this would happen? What if Segaraka's ancient trick hadn't been meant to save the Eldar from the Tan but to create something even worse? What if this was all part of some vast, incomprehensible joke that only a god would find funny? The laughing god had many mysteries, but his greatest mystery was whether he was ultimately on anyone's side at all. In the Eastern Fringe, Warboss Gragnak Skullbreaker was having the time of his life. His Wyack had just conquered its 17th world in 3 months, and the fighting had been absolutely spectacular. The Humies put up decent resistance, the Blue Fish people had fun toys to smash, and there were even some of those spiky chaos gets to crump when things got boring. Life, from Gragnak's perspective, was pretty much perfect. Then his weird boy, a twitchy little git named Zugwort, started having what the other orcs called one of his moments. Zugwort had always been a bit strange, even by weird boy standards. Most of the time he just made things explode with his brain, which was good fun. But sometimes he saw things that hadn't happened yet, and those times were less fun because Zugwort usually started screaming and wouldn't stop until someone knocked him unconscious. This time was different though. This time, Zugwort didn't scream. He just stood there, perfectly still, his eyes glowing with an eerie green light that definitely wasn't the usual Wyack energy. "Boss," Zugwort said in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. "Boss, we gotta run. We gotta run right now." Gragnak laughed, a booming sound that echoed across the battlefield. "Run? Gragnak don't run from nothing. We's the biggest and the strongest. We." "It's coming," Zugwort shrieked, and this time he did sound like himself, only terrified beyond anything Gragnak had ever heard. "De big hungry. De thing what eats UVVA things. It's coming and it's gonna eat everything and we can't fight it 'cause it's too big and too hungry and it's been hungry for so long, boss, we gotta." Gragnak hit Zugwort so hard the weird boy flew 20 feet and smashed into a burning chimera transport. The other orcs cheered, thinking it was good entertainment, but Gragnak wasn't laughing anymore. He'd been around long enough to know when a weird boy was seeing something real versus just having too much whack energy in his head. And Zugwort was seeing something real. The weird part was, other weird boys across the battlefield started having the same reaction. One by one, they stopped what they were doing and turned to face galactic south, toward a region of space that held nothing of interest to orcs. Their eyes all glowed with that same strange green light, and they all whispered the same words in perfect unison. "The big hungry is waking up. And when it gets air, the fighting's gonna stop. Not 'cause we'll die. Worse, we'll forget why we wanted to fight in the first place." For an orc, there was no greater horror imaginable than that. The Necron tomb world of Mandragora had been sleeping for 60 million years. Its occupants, ancient lords and warriors of a civilization that predated human history by millions of years, had gone into their stasis dreaming of the day they would rise again and reclaim the galaxy from the lesser species that infested it. Overlord Thasser the Invincible awoke to screaming. This was unusual. Necrons didn't scream. They'd lost the capacity for such emotional responses when they underwent biotransference and became living metal. They might roar battle cries or issue commands, but screaming, true screaming born of terror, was beyond them. And yet, screaming was exactly what echoed through the tomb's corridors as system after system came online. Thasser rose from his stasis chamber, his ancient body creaking as millions of molecular bonds reformed and energized. His optical sensors flickered to life, bathing the chamber in an eerie green glow. "Report," he commanded, his voice a metallic rasp that hadn't been used in epics. His cryptek, Lord Varash, materialized beside him in a flash of dimensional displacement. The scientist priest's body language was agitated, which was remarkable given how little body language Necrons typically displayed. "Overlord, we have detected the awakening of Tsaranoga. The outsider. The one who should not return." Thasser's consciousness, ancient and vast though it was, took a moment to process this information. The outsider. They had all hoped, prayed, if such beings could pray, that the ancient Tan had been destroyed in the Civil War. Or at minimum, that it would remain in exile until the universe itself ended. Its presence had been deliberately excised from most Necron records, the memory too terrible to preserve. "That's impossible," Thasser said, though even as he spoke he knew it wasn't. The Silent King himself ensured that Tsaranoga would never return. The sphere was. "The sphere is moving, Overlord. It is approaching the galactic plane. Based on current trajectory and velocity, it will enter the eastern fringe in approximately 6 solar months. And Overlord." Varash paused, and if Necrons could swallow nervously, Thasser suspected Varash would have done so. "It has grown larger. Much larger. The energy reading suggested has continued to feed on itself, consuming its own essence in a cycle of self-cannibalization that has only increased its power." Thasser's mind reached back through 60 million years of memory, accessing records that had been sealed since the end of the war in heaven. He remembered the civil war among the Tan, remembered watching as the star gods had turned on each other in an orgy of cosmic fratricide. He remembered the deceiver's role in orchestrating the conflict, remembered how the laughing god of the Eldar had tricked one particular Tan into consuming all of its siblings. He remembered the thing that had emerged from that feeding frenzy, something so massive, so powerful, so utterly insane that even the full might of the Necron Empire at its height had been unable to destroy it. They had tried. Oh, how they had tried. But every attack only seemed to make it stronger, as if it could absorb the energy of their weapons and incorporate it into its own mass. In the end, the Silent King had made the only choice available: seal the outsider away in a prison of its own making, convince it through subtle psychic manipulation that it wanted to exile itself. It had taken the combined efforts of every cryptek in the Empire, working in concert for decades, to plant that single suggestion in the maelstrom of insanity that was the outsider's consciousness. And now that suggestion had apparently worn off. "Activate all defensive protocols," Thasser commanded. "Begin awakening every tomb world within 10,000 light-years. Send transmission to the Sotek dynasty, the Nephrek dynasty, even those upstart Zerkin. This threat supersedes our internal conflicts. Overlord, even if every Necron in the galaxy awakens, I do not believe we possess sufficient force to stop Tsaranoga. It consumed hundreds of our gods. It is, in essence, what the Tan would have become if they had succeeded in devouring all life in the universe. We barely stopped it last time, and we were far more powerful then. Then we will find allies, Thasser said grimly. Alert the lesser species. The Imperium. The Eldar. Even the damned orcs. Make them understand that if the outsider is not stopped, there will be no galaxy left to fight over. Varash's optical sensors flickered with what might have been surprise. Overlord, the lesser species are beneath our notice. They are insects compared to. The lesser species are alive, Varash. They are organic. And the outsider hungers for life above all else. They will fight because they have no choice. And while they distract it, perhaps, we can find a way to finish what we failed to accomplish 60 million years ago. It was a desperate plan. A foolish plan. But it was the only plan Thasser could conceive that had even the slimmest chance of success. As he strode from his chamber to begin preparations, Thasser accessed one final memory file. It showed the last time anyone had seen the outsider before its exile. The sphere had been forming around it then, its own body creating a prison to contain itself. And across its surface, before the metal had fully enclosed it, Thasser had seen something that haunted him still. Faces. Thousands upon thousands of faces, all screaming silently. The faces of every Tan the outsider had consumed, still conscious, still aware, still screaming after millions of years of imprisonment within a body that wasn't their own. If the outsider reached the Milky Way, every living being in the galaxy would join that chorus. An eternity of awareness without hope, of suffering without end, of existence without purpose. Death, Thasser realized, would be a mercy compared to what the outsider had planned. 6 months. That's all the galaxy had. 6 months before something that defied comprehension, something that made the Chaos Gods look like amateur demons, something that was the combined malevolence of hundreds of devoured star gods all compressed into a singular, impossibly vast entity of pure hunger and madness reached the edge of the Milky Way. 6 months before the harvest began. Human scholars would later call it the Tsaranoga incursion. The Eldar called it the Second Sundering. The Orcs, in their typical direct fashion, called it the Big Ungry Times. But names didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in the galaxy's history, every faction, every species that had been at war with each other since time immemorial, faced a choice. Unite, or become part of an eternal labyrinth of impossible geometry where the only constant was suffering and the only certainty was that death would never come to end it. The question wasn't whether they would fight. The question was whether fighting would be enough. Because as astropath Meridian had discovered in her final moments, as Farser Eldarin had seen in his vision, as the Necron overlords had known for 60 million years, the outsider wasn't just hungry. It was patient. It was intelligent. And it had spent its entire exile planning exactly how it would harvest the galaxy when it finally returned home. The sphere continued its slow, inexorable approach. And inside it, something vast and terrible and utterly insane began to stir, its 1,000 stolen voices rising in a song of anticipation. The feast was about to begin. The war room on Terra was a place designed to contain the arrogance of empires. Vaulted ceilings soared hundreds of feet overhead, covered in murals depicting humanity's greatest victories. Golden aquilas gleamed from every surface, and servoskulls floated through the air like mechanical birds of prey, recording everything for posterity. It was a room built to make anyone who entered feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something grand. Today, it felt like a tomb. Lord Commander Militant Cavros stood at the head of the massive strategic table, his weathered face illuminated by the hololithic display that dominated the center of the room. Around him stood representatives from a dozen different imperial institutions, each one looking progressively more uncomfortable as the briefing continued. Inquisitor Valerius of the Ordo Xenos. Fabricator General Zyros of Mars. Captain General Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes. Even a representative from the Officio Assassinorum, though nobody was quite sure why assassins would be relevant to a threat of this magnitude. Explain to me again, Cavros said, his voice dangerously quiet, how something 32 million times the size of Holy Terra went unnoticed until 6 months ago. Captain Helena Sereth stood at attention, trying not to let her hands shake. She'd been pulled from the brig, where she'd been awaiting court-martial for deserting her post when the endless vigil fled the approaching sphere, and brought to Terra in chains. Now those chains were gone, but she felt their weight more heavily than ever. Lord Commander, the object was in intergalactic space, beyond the range of standard auger arrays. It was only detectable because it began reflecting starlight from the Milky Way. Prior to its movement, it would have been effectively invisible against the cosmic background radiation. And now? Cavros asked. Helena swallowed hard. Now it's accelerating. Initial projections gave us 6 months before it reached the galactic plane. New calculations suggest 4 months. Maybe less. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Officers shouted questions, tech priests argued about the validity of the sensor data, and the Inquisitor muttered prayers to the God Emperor under his breath. Only Captain General Valoris remained perfectly still, his gold armor gleaming in the hololithic light, his face hidden behind his sentinel's helm. Silence, Valoris said, and his voice cut through the chaos like a power sword through flesh. Everyone stopped talking immediately. The Adeptus Custodes were the Emperor's own guardians, and when one of them spoke, even Lord Commanders listened. I have consulted the archives, Valoris continued, his voice echoing strangely in the sudden quiet. There are records sealed since the Great Crusade that speak of this entity. The Omnicia himself, he nodded toward Fabricator General Zyros, encountered its prison during the dark age of technology. He understood what it was, what it represented. And he knew that if it ever awoke, no force in this galaxy could stop it. Then what do you suggest? Cavros asked. That we simply surrender? That we bow to this Xenos monstrosity and beg for mercy? I suggest, Valoris said carefully, that we do what we have never done in the history of the Imperium. I suggest we ask for help. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ask for help. From Xenos. From the very creatures the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to exterminate. It was heresy of the highest order. And yet, the Necrons have already reached out, Inquisitor Valerius said quietly, producing a data slate from his robes. Through intermediaries. They claim to have fought this thing before. They claim to know its weaknesses, if such things exist. They're proposing an alliance. Temporary. Until the threat is neutralized. And what do they want in exchange? Cavros demanded. Nothing, Valerius replied. That's what concerns me. The Necrons never do anything without a price. Unless. He paused, his face pale. Unless they're as terrified as we are. On Craftworld Iandin, Farser Eldarin stood before the Council of Seers, trying to make them understand something that transcended understanding. Around him, hololithic images flickered and shifted, showing possibilities and probabilities, futures that branched like the roots of a dying tree. The Monkey are mobilizing, said Farser Kelthrin, her voice dripping with disdain. They scurry about like insects preparing for winter, not understanding that winter will consume them regardless of their preparations. Then we must help them understand, Eldarin replied, his voice firm despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. He hadn't slept in 3 days, hadn't stopped using his foresight to search for any possible path to victory. So far, he'd found none. Help them? Kelthrin laughed, a bitter sound. The Monkey who murdered our people at Valador? The Monkey who desecrate our maiden worlds and destroy our infinity circuits? You would have us ally with them? I would have us survive, Eldarin snapped, his patience finally breaking. Do you not understand what approaches? This isn't another threat we can avoid by fleeing into the webway. This isn't another enemy we can manipulate into fighting our battles. The outsider doesn't care about our politics, our grudges, our ancient pride. It will consume us all equally, and when it's done, there won't be an Eldar civilization left to mourn. The council chamber fell silent. Finally, the autarch Iravatine spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of command. "What do you propose?" "The Harlequins have agreed to act as intermediaries," Eldarin said. "They've been preparing for this since the fall." Sigarak foresaw. He stopped, shaking his head. "No, that's not quite right. Sigarak engineered this. The Laughing God tricked the outsider into consuming its siblings millions of years ago. He created this threat. And now his followers claim he has a plan to stop it." "And you trust this plan?" Kelthrin asked skeptically. "No," Eldarin admitted. "But it's the only chance we have. The Harlequins are calling for a gathering. All races. All factions. Even the Necrons, who they claim created special weapons during the war in heaven specifically designed to harm the Tan. Combined with Eldar Psychers, Monkey faith, or collective belief, and Tau technology, they believe we might be able to create something capable of at least driving it back into exile. And if this alliance fails?" Iravatine asked. Eldarin's next words were heavy with the weight of prophecy. "Then I have seen the future that awaits us all. We will not die. Death would be a kindness. Instead, we will wander forever through impossible corridors in a prison made of our own suffering, conscious enough to know we are trapped but never sane enough to understand why. For eternity." The council voted. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. Survival, it turned out, was a powerful motivator. Warboss Gragnak didn't understand most of what was happening. There were too many words, too much talking, not enough fighting. But he understood one thing very clearly: something was coming that would make fighting impossible. And that was unacceptable. "So let me get this straight," he said, addressing the bizarre collection of beings assembled in neutral space, an ancient space station that predated human history, maintained by the Harlequins for exactly this kind of impossible meeting. "You humies, you pointy-eared gits, and you skeleton boys all want us orcs to help fight this big ungry thing?" "That is correct," said the Necron representative, Overlord Thasser. His mechanical voice held no emotion, but his posture suggested barely restrained impatience. "The entity approaches. Time grows short. We require your species' unique psychic resonance." E means Dewyak, supplied Zugwort, who'd been brought along specifically to translate the complicated stuff. "The big ungry feeds on reality, yeah? But Dewyak, it makes its own reality. If enough of us boys believe something is real, it becomes real. They think we can use that." Gragnak's eyes lit up with understanding. "So if we believe we can beat this thing, we can beat it." "It's not quite that simple," began the Tau envoy, Commander Brightsword, but Gragnak wasn't listening anymore. "Boys," he roared, his voice echoing through the station. "We's gonna crump the biggest, baddest, most horrible thing that ever existed. And when we's done, everyone in the galaxy will know that orcs is the strongest." The assembled orcs, over 500 of them, representing different clans from across the galaxy, erupted in cheers. Their collective Wyak energy pulsed through the station, making lights flicker and causing the Eldar representatives to wince in psychic pain. "Remarkable," muttered Fabricator General Zyros, his sensors registering the impossible energy readings. "Their belief is literally warping local reality. If we could weaponize this." "That's exactly what we intend to do," said a new voice, and everyone turned to see a figure that hadn't been there a moment before. The Harlequin solitaire called Midnight's Jest stood at the center of the gathering, his presence causing ripples in reality itself. Solitaires were the rarest of Harlequins, the only ones who could perform the role of the Chaos God Slaanesh in their plays. They were half-mad, touched by darkness, and utterly terrifying to anyone who understood what they represented. "The plan is simple," Midnight's Jest said, and despite his cheerful tone, nobody missed the edge in his voice. "We're going to do what my God did millions of years ago. We're going to trick the outsider. But this time, instead of tricking it into consuming its siblings, we're going to trick it into consuming itself." "Impossible," Thasser said flatly. Saranoga has been feeding on its own essence for 60 million years. It's adapted to it. The process only makes it stronger. Ordinarily, yes, the Harlequin agreed. But what if it consumed something it couldn't digest? Something so fundamentally opposed to its nature that it would tear the entity apart from the inside? What could possibly, Helena began, but then understanding dawned on her face. No. You can't be serious. Midnight's Jest's grin widened behind his mask. Oh, but I am. We're going to feed the outsiders something it's never encountered before. Something that's been growing in the warp for 10,000 years, feeding on faith and belief and the psychic energy of quadrillions of human souls. The Emperor breathed Inquisitor Valerius, his face going pale. You want to use the God Emperor as bait. Not bait, the Harlequin corrected. As a weapon. The outsider feeds on physical matter, on souls, on energy from real space. It cannot process warp energy in its current form. It was created before the war in heaven, before the warp became the hell it is today. If we can channel even a fraction of the Emperor's psychic presence into the outsider through a specially prepared vessel. He trailed off meaningfully. It will create a paradox, Fabricator General Zyros said slowly, his analytical mind working through the implications. An entity of pure order consuming chaos. A being designed to devour physical reality trying to digest metaphysical energy. The resulting conflict would tear it apart, Thasser finished. Not destroy it completely, nothing can truly destroy a Tan. But it would fragment the outsider back into its component entities. Shatter it into manageable pieces that could then be imprisoned separately. There's just one problem, Helena said quietly. How do we get the outsider to consume this vessel? It's insane, but it's not stupid. It's been plotting this return for 60 million years. It won't just eat something we offer it. Midnight's Jest turned to look at her, and even through his mask, Helena felt the weight of his gaze. That's where you come in, Captain. You've already touched the outsider's consciousness. When your navigator died aboard the Endless Vigil, you were present. The outsider saw you. It knows you. And it will remember you. Helena's blood ran cold. What are you saying? I'm saying you're going to volunteer to be the vessel. You're going to carry a fragment of the Emperor's consciousness, not enough to kill you, but enough to be noticeable. You're going to fly directly into that sphere. And when the outsider takes you into its harvest, when it adds you to its labyrinth of suffering, it will consume what you carry inside you. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Helena. And what happens to me? She asked, though she already knew the answer. You'll be inside the outsider when the paradox triggers, the Harlequin said softly. You'll be at the epicenter when an entity composed of hundreds of Tan tries to process warp energy and faith and the psychic essence of humanity's greatest defender. The resulting explosion will be visible from one end of the galaxy to the other. I'll die, Helena said simply. Yes, Midnight's Jest confirmed. But everyone in the galaxy will live. Every world. Every species. Every soul that would have spent eternity trapped in an impossible labyrinth of suffering will instead have a chance at the future. Isn't that worth dying for? Helena looked around the room. At the Eldar who had killed her people. At the Necrons who viewed humanity as insects. At the Orcs who would fight anyone for any reason. At the Tau who claimed to offer the greater good but had conquered human worlds in its name. These were her enemies. The enemies of humanity. The enemies of the Imperium. And yet. How long do I have? She asked. 3 weeks, Thasser replied. That's when the sphere will enter the galaxy proper. We'll prepare you. Teach you to contain the Emperor's gift without being consumed by it. And then. He trailed off. And then I fly into hell and take it with me, Helena finished. She stood straighter, her fear falling away like a discarded cloak. If she was going to die, she would die like a soldier of the Imperium. With duty. With honor. With purpose. I'll do it, she said. But I have one condition. Name it, said Lord Commander Cavros, speaking for the first time since the Harlequin had revealed the plan. When this is over, if it works, I want this alliance to continue. Not forever. Not even for long. But long enough to make sure this never happens again. Long enough to establish protocols for threats that transcend our petty wars. Can you promise me that? The representatives looked at each other. Eldar. Human. Necron. Orc. Tau. Species that had been killing each other for millennia. Species that would probably go back to killing each other the moment this crisis was resolved. But in that moment, looking at a human woman who was volunteering to sacrifice herself for all of them, they found something that transcended their hatred. We promise, they said in unison. 3 weeks later, Captain Helena Sereth sat in the cockpit of a modified Fury Interceptor, the smallest ship that could make the journey into intergalactic space and back. Except she wouldn't be coming back. The ship had been stripped of everything except engines, sensors, and a single pilot's seat. There was no room for weapons. No room for supplies. Just barely enough room for Helena and the thing she carried inside her. She could feel it burning in her chest, a warmth that was equal parts agony and ecstasy. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness that the most powerful psychers in the Imperium had carefully, agonizingly transferred into her mortal form. It was like trying to hold a star in your hands. It wanted to expand, to burn, to consume everything around it. Only her will and the psychic dampeners the Eldar had woven into her body kept it contained. For now. Captain Sereth, crackled a voice over the Vox. Farser Eldarin. They'd spent the last 3 weeks working together, him teaching her meditation techniques to control the power inside her. She'd never thought she'd consider an Eldar a friend, but then again, she'd never thought she'd volunteer for a suicide mission either. I'm here, she replied. The sphere has begun to open, Eldarin said, and Helena could hear the strain in his voice. The outsider is preparing to enter the galaxy. You need to go now. Before it fully emerges. Before it becomes too aware to fall for the trap. Helena looked out through her cockpit canopy. In the distance, impossible to miss, the sphere had begun to split along invisible seams. Light spilled out from the cracks, not normal light, but something that hurt to look at, light that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. And through those cracks, she could see things moving. Shapes that were too large, too complex, too wrong for her mind to fully process. The outsider. Saranoga. The amalgamation of hundreds of devoured gods, finally awakening from its 60 million year sleep. Engaging engines, Helena said calmly. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. Strange, how calm she felt. How right this all seemed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a disgraced captain facing court-martial. Now she was going to save the galaxy. Not bad for a career ending, she thought. The Fury leaped forward, its engines burning at maximum capacity. Behind her, she knew, the Allied fleet was forming up, thousands of ships from every faction, ready to contain any fragments of the outsider that survived her attack. They'd be following at a safe distance, weapons charged, prayer said, belief focused. The orcs were chanting somewhere in the fleet, their collective Wyack energy creating a bubble of imposed reality that would hopefully protect the fleet from the outsider's madness-inducing presence. The Eldar were singing, weaving a psychic shield of crystal harmonies. The Tau were calculating firing solutions with their usual precision. And the Necrons were waiting with weapons that hadn't been used since the War in Heaven, ancient technologies designed specifically to harm beings like the Tan. But none of it would matter if Helena failed. The sphere loomed closer. It was like flying toward a planet, except this planet was metal and madness and impossible geometry all twisted together. The cracks had widened now, revealing the interior, a vast space that seemed to stretch into infinity, filled with corridors and chambers that folded in on themselves in ways that violated every law of physics. And everywhere, faces. Millions of faces embedded in the metal walls, all screaming silently. The harvest. Everyone the outsider had ever consumed, trapped forever in its essence. Helena's vox crackled. Captain, we're detecting massive psychic disturbance. The outsider is becoming aware of your approach. It's... Eldarin's voice broke off. Oh gods. It remembers you. It's happy you've returned. Good, Helena said, and meant it. That means it wants me. That means the plan will work. She flew through one of the cracks, and reality broke. The corridor stretched before her in impossible directions. Up was down, forward was backward, time moved sideways. She could see the past and future simultaneously, could watch herself entering the sphere while also seeing her own skeleton decorating one of the walls. The ship's instruments went haywire, spinning through readings that made no sense. But Helena didn't need instruments. She could feel the outsider's attention focusing on her, a vast intelligence composed of thousands of tormented minds all screaming in unison. She could feel its hunger, its anticipation, its terrible joy at having fresh prey to add to its collection. Welcome, said the voice she'd heard in Eldarin's vision, the voice of 1,010 speaking as one. Welcome to my harvest, little mortal. I remember you. Your navigator tasted so sweet when she died. And now you've brought yourself to me. How thoughtful. The ship stopped. Not because Helena had cut the engines, but because the outsider had simply decided it should stop. Physics didn't apply here. Nothing applied except the outsider's will. Helena felt herself being pulled from the cockpit, felt her body lifting through the metal hull as if it were mist. She emerged into a vast chamber that was simultaneously a room, a planet, and a universe. And at its center, looking down at her with eyes that were black holes and supernovas and every form of stellar death combined, was the outsider. It was impossible to describe. Try to imagine a creature made of distorted starlight and living metal, hundreds of miles tall, its body covered in the screaming faces of consumed gods. Now multiply that horror by 1,000 and you'd begin to approach what Helena was seeing. You carry something interesting inside you, the outsider observed, its 1,000 voices curious. A fragment of something powerful. Something that tastes like hope? Faith? How quaint. Did you think this would protect you, little mortal? No, Helena said, and despite everything, she smiled. I thought it would kill you. The outsider laughed, a sound like stars dying. Nothing can kill me. I am the sum of all my siblings. I am the ultimate predator. I am. It stopped. Its countless eyes widened. It had just noticed what was inside Helena. Really noticed. No, it whispered, and for the first time, there was fear in its voices. That's not possible. That's warp energy. That's faith made manifest. That's a gift from the Emperor of Mankind, Helena said. And it's all yours. She didn't wait for the outsider to respond. She didn't give it a chance to reject what she carried. Instead, she opened herself completely, tearing down every mental barrier, every psychic dampener, every protection the Eldar had woven into her soul. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness exploded outward. It was like a star going supernova inside her chest. Pure golden light erupted from every pore, every cell, consuming her mortal form and transforming it into a beacon of faith so bright it could be seen from Terra itself. The outsider tried to retreat, tried to reject what it was being fed, but it was too late. It had already begun to consume Helena, had already started to add her to its harvest. And with her came the Emperor's gift. The outsider screamed. All 1,000 of its voices screamed in unison as it tried to process what was happening. Order versus chaos. Physical versus metaphysical. The hunger of the Tan versus the faith of humanity. The two forces were fundamentally incompatible, like matter and antimatter, like positive and negative space. Where they met, reality itself began to tear. Helena felt herself dying, felt her consciousness fragmenting and spreading throughout the outsider's form. But even as she died, she could see what was happening. The outsider was coming apart. Not all at once, something this powerful couldn't be destroyed so easily, but piece by piece, God by God, the consumed Tan were being separated from the Gestalt whole. The deceiver was the first to break free, his essence screaming as it was torn from the collective. Then the Nightbringer, its form wreathed in death energy. Then dozens of others, minor Tan whose names had been lost to history, all of them ripped from the outsider's body by the paradox Helena had introduced. And at the center of it all, the core of the outsider itself, the original entity, Saranoga, writhed in agony as it tried desperately to hold itself together. And oh, it screamed. I am the harvest. I am the end of all things. I am. You are defeated, said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Helena, with the last shreds of her consciousness, recognized it. The Emperor. Speaking through her, using her sacrifice as a conduit. You are the old god's folly. You are the price of hubris. And you are finished. The golden light intensified, becoming so bright that it exceeded visible spectrum, becoming pure psychic energy that burned through the outsider like acid through flesh. The sphere around them began to crack, massive fractures spreading across its surface as the containment failed. Outside, the Allied fleet watched in awe and terror as the sphere exploded. It wasn't a normal explosion. There was no fire, no shockwave of debris. Instead, the sphere simply unraveled. The impossible geometry that held it together came undone, the twisted dimensions snapping back into normal space like rubber bands that had been stretched too far. And from the heart of the explosion, hundreds of smaller fragments shot out in every direction, each one glowing with sickly green light. The Tan shards. The components of the outsider, separated and scattered across the void. All ships, engage. Overlord Thasser's voice rang across every channel. Contain those shards before they can escape or reconstitute. The fleet moved as one, thousands of ships from dozens of factions working in perfect coordination. Necron tomb ships deployed their ancient containment technology. Eldar vessels wove nets of psychic energy. Imperial ships used faith and fury. Orc ships used the power of belief. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. One by one, the shards were captured. Imprisoned. Locked away in specially prepared containers that would keep them separated for eternity. It took 3 days of constant effort, 3 days of coordinating dozens of languages and hundreds of different technologies, but in the end, every shard was accounted for. Every shard except one. Farser Eldarin stood on the bridge of his craft world, staring at the readings with a mixture of triumph and dread. The core, he whispered. Saranoga's original essence. Where did it go? They searched for weeks, deploying every scanner, every auger, every psychic probe. But the answer was always the same, nothing. The original outsider, the entity that had started this nightmare, had vanished. Either it had been destroyed completely, which seemed impossible for a Tan, or it had escaped to some dimension or realm beyond their ability to detect. Perhaps, Midnight's Jest said when they finally abandoned the search, that is for the best. Every story needs a mystery. Every ending needs a question mark. It gives us something to remember. Something to fear. Something to keep us vigilant. Or something that will return to haunt us, Eldarin replied darkly. The Harlequin just smiled behind his mask. Well, yes. That too. The Treaty of Seretha's sacrifice, as it came to be known, lasted exactly 6 months after the outsider's defeat. 6 months of uneasy cooperation, of sharing technology and intelligence, of working together to ensure the captured Tan shards were properly imprisoned across the galaxy where no single faction could claim them all. Then, inevitably, old hatreds resurfaced. An Orc Wyak attacked an Imperial world. The Eldar raided a Tau colony. The Necrons resumed their campaign to claim the galaxy. Within a year, it was as if the Alliance had never existed. But it had existed. And that mattered. On Terra, in the Hall of Heroes beneath the Imperial Palace, a statue was erected. It showed Captain Helena Sereth in her pilot's seat, her face calm, her hand steady on the controls. The inscription read simply, "She gave her life so that all might live." Remember her. Remember what we can accomplish together. On Iandin, the Eldar composed a song about the human who carried the light of her god into darkness and did not falter. They sang it rarely, only on the darkest nights, but they sang it. The orcs told stories about the little Humi what was tougher than a god, and while the details changed with each telling, the core remained the same. Sometimes, the smallest fighter has the biggest impact. Even the Necrons, who claimed to feel nothing, maintained a file on Helena Sereth. Overlord Thasser personally ensured it was preserved in the most secure archives, where it would survive until the end of time. Because even beings of living metal understood the value of remembering those who saved you, even if they were lesser species. And somewhere, in a dimension that existed outside normal space and time, a fragment of Helena's consciousness lingered. She was dead, there was no question about that, but something of her had survived the explosion, caught between the material and immaterial, preserved in the moment of her sacrifice like an insect in amber. She couldn't act. Couldn't speak. Couldn't affect the physical world in any meaningful way. But she could watch. Could see the galaxy continuing to turn, species continuing to war, life continuing to flourish. And in her eternal vigil, she knew something that few others suspected: the outsider's core hadn't been destroyed. It had retreated. Gone back into the void between galaxies to recover, to reconstitute, to plan its next attempt. But that would take millions of years. And by then, perhaps the galaxy would be ready. Perhaps the Alliance could be reformed. Perhaps the lesson learned from her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the galaxy would tear itself apart long before the outsider returned. Perhaps all her sacrifice would buy was time, a few million years of existence before the inevitable end. But time was enough. Time was everything. Time meant life, meant hope, meant possibility. Helena smiled, or would have if she still had a face. Her vigil would continue. Her watch would never end. And if the outsider ever returned, if it ever threatened the galaxy again, she would be there. Waiting. Ready. Eternal. So, far beneath the surface of Mars, and chambers that had been sealed since before the Age of Strife, something stirred. The void dragon, the tan that the Emperor himself had imprisoned millennia ago, shifted in its eternal sleep. It had felt the outsider's defeat. Had felt its siblings' essence scattered across the galaxy. And it had smiled, if beings of living metal could smile. The game was changing. The old players were making moves. And soon, very soon, it would be time for the void dragon to make its own play. But not yet. Not quite yet. For now, it would sleep. And dream. And wait for the moment when humanity's faith wavered, when the Emperor's grip on reality weakened, when the opportunity arose to break free and claim what was rightfully its. The Tan were patient. They had all the time in the universe. And the universe, for all its vastness, was getting smaller every day. The end was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. And when it came, the galaxy would burn in the light of dying stars, and the feast would begin anew. But that is a story for another time. Finally, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, unlikely allies emerge. And sometimes, a single act of sacrifice can save everything. Remember Captain Helena Sereth. Remember what was given. Remember what was gained. And watch the void between galaxies. Because nothing that powerful is ever truly gone. It's just waiting.